I want to welcome to the program Kari Lydersen. She's a journalism lecturer at Northwestern University, staff writer at Midwest Energy, writing in these times, the case for nationalizing the railroads. Kari, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Let's just start with where we are with the railroads in this country in terms of, and we're talking about freight rail. I think people would be surprised to know how consolidated this industry is, how much money they have begun to make in terms of profits, and how, the thing that struck me in reading your piece, some of this stuff I knew, some of it I didn't, but what struck me is how much of a dramatic change we've had really in the past decade or two with these freight railroads, and how much the quality of what they do has gone down.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was one of the biggest revelations for me starting to delve into this topic in the past couple of years is, covering labor. It's no surprise that workers are treated badly and, corners seem to be cut on safety. And a lot of this you hear in all different industries. But one thing that is really striking with the situation with the railroads is how the service is just breaking down too, and how the companies that are shipping on the railroads are getting more and more frustrated and feeling that it's just dysfunctional. And, even as the freight railroads become more and more profitable, they're not actually serving, they're definitely, the workers are definitely unhappy for all sorts of reasons we can talk about. And they're also just not doing a good job of fulfilling the actual function that, they were granted all these many hundreds of millions of acres of land, 150 years ago. And that they've gotten all these concessions from the government to be this common carrier that carries our freight. And they're really not living up to that promise either.
I want to get to that aspect in a bit, but let's talk about the sort of the problems that are going on here, because I think the other thing I want to talk about is that notion of them being a common carrier. And really, in many respects, I think there's a hesitation for folks like us to use the national security, but this is really in many respects a national security. When we talk about things that people want to have in their lives in terms of security, like food and, goods, this is a national security issue in many respects. But before we get there, tell us a little about these hearings in April of 2022. And, we've heard about precision scheduled railroading in the context of why there's only two people working on a train that's 2 miles long. But go into it's not just about adding massive profits for these hedge funders, essentially, although we should touch on that. But it also ends up just creating bad service and not functioning well for the rest of our supply chain.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's why these hearings were held last April with the Surface Transportation Board, which is the federal entity that railroads have been really deregulated, but there's still this board that, has some regulatory power over them. So these emergency hearings were held. This was before the possible strike, long before the East Palestine derailment. So, when it wasn't so much in the national news, but people in all these different industries and the workers, were really upset about how the railroads were functioning and how they were failing. So there was a lot of testimony there from shippers and labor leaders and other kinds of officials about these serious shortcomings that they were seeing only getting worse, partly because of this precision scheduled railroading practice and the more general philosophy of the big railroad company, freight railroad companies, trying to, sort of sideline jobs and portions of track that weren't very profitable and just concentrate on the work that was most profitable for them. And this precision scheduled railroading, it's way too complicated to really try to explain right now. But basically this philosophy that on paper sounds like it would be efficient and would work for everyone, and in practice is really the exact opposite, and just as a way for railroads to try to operate with as few staff as possible. And it ends up making it also really efficient for shippers to ship things when they want, because they're sort of held hostage by when the railroads, when it's most profitable for them to ship things. So really a lot of discontent and the workers and shippers were really united in their discontent and their what they saw as the reasons for these problems when they testified in April.
The thing that I think people have to keep in mind as we start to get into the idea of what the fix is for this is that this is not like a nascent industry. This is not an industry that needs help to grow. Like if we don't give it, if we're not allowing them to, there's no research development going on here, right? I mean, these are trains on train tracks, and we've had these for almost 200 years. And this is just about hedge funds coming in, taking over these industries, saying, we can bring in consultants or whatever it is, or efficiency experts, not to do anything better than we're doing right now, but just to essentially extract from these existing industry, and we should say, this is happening in a lot of different industries. I mean, it's happening in everything from dentists to railroads. I mean, and everything in between. But they're coming in and saying okay, this is a functioning business. How do we extract profits out of it on the backs of workers, on the backs of retail outfits, on the backs of our national security? I mean, all of it. It's just taking away from everybody else so that they can lard their pockets. And there is no societal benefit to this whatsoever, is there? They're not building more tracks. They're reducing the amount of tracks. They're not going more places. They're going to fewer places. It's really an assault on our infrastructure.
Yeah, that's also well said. And then I would actually add another layer to that, though. In some ways, it's the same basic industry as it was in the 1800s, but there is also all this new technology that has and can make railroads safer, but could make them a lot safer if it was more fully implemented. And if warning signs like, the very basic warning sign in East Palestine were actually heeded. And then on the environmental front, railroads are already the most environmental way to ship freight, but they could be much more environmental if you made more investments in the technology that does exist now for electrification and otherwise making the railroads cleaner. So, I mean, there actually is a lot of new technology that is not being fully utilized or invested in because the money is being funneled to profit rather than reinvested in making the system as modern and as clean and efficient as it could be.
Well, but the efficiency point I think is key, right? Because they use models that are supposedly efficient, right? Where they're attempting to cut down on the labor force so much so that it creates maximum efficiency, or extending these rail cars so that they can carry as much as possible. But efficiency for society is not efficiency for the railroads, right? Their purpose is to ensure that they can carry as much with as lean of a labor model as possible, paying as few people as possible to transport as much stuff. Can you just expand on that being so widespread within freight rail and within railroads in particular? The efficiency being really for executives so that they can extract the most amount of profit, as opposed to it being for society.
Exactly. Yeah. And the staffing structure with this precision scheduled railroading is a perfect example of that. And it's kind of coming back to bite them, because at those April hearings, a lot of the shippers were testifying that part of the problem they were seeing, the big root of the problem actually, was that the railroads are now short-staffed. They've cut, I think it's 45,000 workers over recent years in the industry as a whole. But then they're having trouble even getting the workers that they need even to staff this system, because even though the pay is pretty decent, it's become a really undesirable job. And a lot of workers are essentially on call all the time. So they really have no private life. And, not that many people want to do that even for good pay. There is this the efficiency, I mean, even the profit for the railroads, probably will break down over time if this kind of out of control train isn't changed. Not to mention everything that Norfolk Southern will have to probably pay for the East Palestine derailment, and these savings for efficiency, even by their own definition, even the corporate efficiency, are short term. I mean, that's one of the big criticisms you hear about things being hedge fund driven and investor driven across all sectors, is that it's all a short term lens. And I mean, even the companies may suffer in the long term with this approach. And then, as you said, efficiency for society as a whole is really suffering, and companies are having to pay more to ship stuff in less environmental ways because the railroads aren't really functioning well. And then everyone pays for that in pollution and in higher prices. So it is really an inefficient system in the big picture, for sure.
I'm correct, I think, in saying that something like 90 some odd percent of all the freight comes from basically 5 or 6 companies. You cite that the average profit margins of the top 5 U.S. railroads have roughly doubled in the past 15 years. Has more or less the freight over the course of that time, the amount of tonnage or however it's measured, really changed dramatically during that time? I can't imagine it has.
Yeah, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but it hasn't doubled. At least in by certain measurements, it's decreased. So yeah, it's not like they're shipping twice the amount and doing twice as good service, and that's why their profits are double. It's actually the opposite. It goes back to how they've stripped out, the less profitable type of work they were doing and focused on and then used their quasi-monopoly powers, to just maximize their profits for this work.
So they got a bunch of free land back in the 1800s, something to the effect of 175 million acres of land. They have received all sorts of other benefits. They are given this land, and we actually, Amtrak has to sort of pay, and that it's a quasi-public operated entity that has to pay and sort of work around the freight industry's, whatever works for their profits, essentially. 2-mile train crosses the tracks. The Amtrak's got to reschedule their stuff. I mean, that's just basically it. Let's talk about what would be, if we understand that this is a national security issue, that these things function not unlike, the highway system, which is a common carrier system. It is owned by the federal government. There's no reason why, we could theoretically rent out, you want time on our federally owned tracks. You can do that. We charge tolls, and gasoline tax. We could do some similar situation for trains and organizing it that way. So the logistical standpoint and the philosophical, I guess, idea, it's not that hard to wrap our heads around. What would it take? Like, what are the methodologies in which if we were to nationalize the trains, like, how would that happen? Would we need legislation? Would we need, what kind of authority would the U.S. government need to do something like this?
Yeah, like you said, there's 2 probably basic models where it could happen. One, if the government took over the entire industry, including the actual companies like BNSF that do the shipping. That would be a pretty huge deal and probably not likely anytime soon. But what you described is the case in many countries. The full nationalization is the case in many countries too. But the government owning the tracks and charging or offering concessions to use the tracks, like that's, as you said, a very straightforward model to imagine. So for that to actually happen, on just sort of a common sense, ethical level, given that all this land was given to the railroads and that they've had the chance over so many decades to profit off it, it seems like the railroads would sort of owe something back to the country in return. But, legally and constitutionally, that would involve taking private property. Eminent domain is often used to take land, but of course you still have to compensate. And say in cases where electric utilities have been municipalized or there's been attempts to municipalize them, which means the local government taking them over. They owe a lot of money to the companies, the utility companies, for those assets. In this case, the electric wires that the utility companies built and maintained over all that time. So, the government could theoretically basically buy the tracks and the lands back from the railroads. We'd be talking about massive amounts of money. And then there's in the past,
let me ask you this.
railroads.
I'm curious about this. Like, if I'm coming in on building a highway, I'm a city, I'm building a highway, and I take people's houses or their buildings where there was business taking place there, I'm responsible to pay for the value of the land and maybe the structures, but not necessarily for the profits that could have been made because of that location, right? Like, I mean, I had a hot dog stand here on this corner, and it was a very valuable piece of real estate where it was. I can move my hot dog stand down the road, but there's no foot traffic there, and I'm not going to make as much money. Like, I guess that's part of the issue there, like, right? I mean, like, they've doubled their profits in 16 years. That doesn't necessarily give you a sense of what the value of that operation is if it was run in a way that is supposed to service what it's supposed to service, right? Like, I mean,
if there was any measure of redundancy that would be proportionate to what, I mean,
just in terms of like, yeah, I mean, just and never mind redundancy. I mean, like they're causing price increases down the line. They're causing bottlenecks. They're causing delays. They're also, causing huge safety concerns. But I guess there would be that would all be a negotiation. So that's a tough road to hoe. But what about, you also suggest buying the shares of these companies, and the sort of the precedent there is what the U.S. government did for, I think it was a GM, in the wake of the financial crisis. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's a model of nationalizing that's actually been proposed by some prominent people for the fossil fuel industry as well. So that's just sort of working within our, well-accepted capitalist system to buy up stock in a company until you basically own and control the company. And that would be, in that case, the whole hog, not just the tracks, but that would be buying up power in, the entire company. So that seems like it would be something that would be doable. Again, it would be absolutely massive amounts of money. And I'm sure there'd be various legal wrangling that would go on. But, it's something that's happened in the hostile ways or bailout, quote unquote, bailout ways plenty of times in the past. So, that is another model that's been put out there.
Is there anybody in Congress who has done any work on researching this, on proposing legislation to this effect? I mean, because I on some level, I think this is pretty far-fetched. It can't happen. But also then you think about like what happened in East Palestine, and maybe we're a couple of those away from a real, reckoning as to like, why do we have something like there's absolutely, I guess there's an argument that if you really want different flavors of soda, you need to have a bunch of different soda companies out there, and you don't want the government to own all the soda companies because you'll just get one flavor. I mean, I'm just stretching here, but there doesn't seem to be any rational argument as to why there is an iota of value that these things are privatized, and there is multiple arguments as to why it is a detriment to the national security of this country. So is there anybody out there who's proposed legislation? Is this one of those things that perennially comes up? Is there a lawmaker out there who's been sort of like beating this drum?
I mean, in terms of lawmakers, I'm pretty sure not. It is a pretty politically a political stretch to start taking private property from these massive companies. So as far as I know, there aren't lawmakers talking about it, but lawmakers have acknowledged that this industry is in crisis, and they did pass a law, obviously, last fall to crush a strike. So, they were willing to take that kind of action. But it really, in terms of some degree of nationalization, it really is so far the workers and some pundits who are pushing that argument. And, it may take some time, a lot of time maybe, for it to percolate up to lawmakers. But, when things are in crisis, things can happen quickly. And this debate is getting more prominent. So who knows, maybe it is something that will be discussed sooner than we would have expected in actual Congress or the administration.
Yeah, well, with labor behind it, it needs to be discussed more, and there needs to be, I think, a lawmaker that takes up that mantle. But even in the more immediate term, right? Like I loved how you, in your piece, had two different tracks that we just kind of laid out: the horizontal separation, or the one that might be easier, the one that's the vertical one. But how about antitrust in the short term? Like, these regional monopolies are so that's a big part of the problem too, right? Like, they just have a chokehold in their area of the country. Would that be a viable option to move forward, at least in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's also being discussed and is much more likely to happen. And I think is, sort of in the works to some degree, because the regulators do already have the power to approve or deny mergers among these companies. And in the past, they've pretty much always approved them. But and especially the shippers, a lot of companies increasing competition as opposed to nationalizing is a much more comfortable model. And, ironically, in this situation, you can achieve some of the same goals possibly by increasing competition or nationalizing, because the goal in both cases is breaking up the stranglehold that these handful of companies have on the industry. But, I know a lot of the workers would much rather see the nationalization model, and more competition could have benefits for workers and the industry, but that could also go off the rails as well. But that is the more realistic thing that would happen soon, I think.
Kari Lydersen, the piece is in Mother Jones, The Case for Nationalizing the Railroads.
In These Times.
In These Times.
Apologies. We will put a link to that piece at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.